Let's start with the globalization. Keohane and Nye, what's new, what's not, and so what? Again, this case is from the year 2000, and the reason why I still assign it is because these are considered two of the great globalization scholars to date. So Keohane and Nye, Robert Keohane from Duke, a professor at Duke University, and Joseph Nye at Harvard University's Kennedy Center for Government. So they've been on the case for a while. And I figured we'd start here. It's a good way to start to see, how has the literature and the debate on globalization progressed, and what does it look like the rhetoric that maybe professors say or the media said back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, the early 2000s, till now, till reality, and try to compare that. So we start here. Who could tell me a little bit about the case, just the general? What are they discussing? So we'll start with that. Again, it's more of a conversational approach here for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to.
Yeah, they kind of talk about the difference, about where the word came from and what the difference is between that and interdependence, and that they were talking about in the 70s, interdependence and how globalization is different.
Okay. Yeah. So tell me, what would you consider different? How would you discern between globalization, let's say, or per se, and interdependence?
The Mesa, or? Yeah, so I would say the difference would be just the way they describe it in the article. It's kind of interdependence is more like a straight line. That's kind of how from country to country or something like that. Whereas globalization is it's broadening and it's getting more and more intertwined.
Right, the world is flat.
Players and stuff like that, fourth, fifth players.
And then everybody else, jump in, raise your hand, attack, try to pounce and help out your teammates, or get a little feisty if you want. Yeah, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think one of the examples they used was the U.S. and Japan are they're interdependent on each other, but that's not, their relationship isn't considered globalism. You need more players for that to be considered that.
Okay. So what would be some of the dimensions that we'd be looking at in order to say this is truly global versus maybe international or interdependent?
One of the things that the article mentions, the two key characteristics I think that globalization or globalism have to cover are there has to be a network of connections, not just single linkages that are sporadically spread out. And I think also they mentioned that it has to include multi-continental distances and not just regional networks. So something wouldn't be considered globalization if it was maybe just a network relationship between the US and Canada. But if you added the US, Canada, and then maybe an East Asian country, for example, that could be considered something that was more globalizing.
So you're looking for different links, right? And then there was so what are the four global dimensions? That'll be the first question I ask. Some of you all, you could either list them to me or just give me them, and then somebody else could define them, but list them. I mean, what do you?
Economic, military, environmental, and social/cultural.
Okay, and I don't want to make you do the whole thing, so just pick one that you thought was interesting and maybe give it to me.
I would say that probably the social-cultural one is
okay.
The most interesting because there's a lot of nuance to it. When you have to be educated in both the finance, the trade. You have to know the laws of certain places, but you also have to know how to accommodate people in a more intimate way.
Yeah. So the customs.
Yeah, through customs.
So even sort of the way you approach someone might be different in one country versus another. So with French, and I lived in England a long time, so with French people, and this is again generalizing, but the idea is, and you find this in sort of textbooks, is that you want to, when you're doing business, you want to first, small talk a bit first, don't be dry, you might have a cup of wine, or you might, talk about your family for a little while, and then you finally you don't want to just jump. But they're also understanding. So it's not like this black and white thing where it becomes sort of like a stereotype, because they're also used to the stereotype of the German, which is the neighbor. They're German neighbors, which are more like the cut and dry, let's do business. So, a lot of the stuff in the textbook is why I don't go off the textbook, is because it's a lot of silly things. But I think when we're coming into the global world, we're all sort of open-minded. And I think that's the approach many states would take. So, but culture is definitely interesting, because how you market a certain product in one country is going to differ in another. Some foods, some services just might not really work well. So one of the things I was thinking was Starbucks in Italy. I don't know if that's ever taken off in Italy. Has it? Anybody know? Anybody from Italy here, or no, any Italians? So in Miami, that's another issue. So Miami's big on coffee too. So Cuban coffee you could buy pretty much anywhere. Anybody had Cuban coffee before? And I just never, so I never understood how Starbucks would work so well in Miami, but it has. So it still has, even though you could go to a window, you could smoke too while you're going to the window, which is another, I guess it's just for the older. You can like smoke a cigar up to the window and order a coffee for $1, because they don't really charge you that much at the restaurants for it. It's sort of like a thing that's there, like culturally, and then you go in to eat or something, and they just have that at the window, like, yeah, well, you want a cup of coffee? Sure, whatever, sit down, and they'll have like some patio furniture. But I guess, I don't know, but Starbucks still works in Miami, and I actually used it a lot too, so I was skeptical about it, like, I don't see the point of a Starbucks, considering so many Cuban cafeterias or whatever. But then you go in there and you spend 2 hours sitting there drinking a coffee on your computer or something, writing something, and then you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. It's like something else, like kind of like more like a French bistro type vibe to it or something, or somewhere where you'd even meet a friend to talk a little bit. As opposed to the Cuban place where you do meet friends, but you don't meet them for that long. It's just like a 10-minute thing max, and then you're like, all right, see you, dude, or whatever. So yeah, so interesting. But those are the cultural things. So who could list off some of the other ones? Tell me about the economic, perhaps.
Yeah, I'll go to the environmental one, because I don't know, when I was reading it, I felt like economic, military, and the social and cultural, those seemed pretty, straightforward. But I was pretty surprised by the environmental globalism piece. Specifically when they mentioned that environmental globalism can be things that are entirely natural and have no connection to like human activity or anything like that. That that confused me a little bit as to how that would be considered globalism.
Well, I mean, again, this is just the author's conceptualizations of it. So, I mean, if there's a global issue, so maybe like the ozone layer, like he says here on page 107, or, what is it, like global warming? If we are, I mean, I think we are at the point where we can say it. I don't know. In Florida, I have to deal with more climate deniers. I don't know. But I sort of try to take the middle ground, like, hey, the ice caps are sort of like melting, and there is sort of evidence. So maybe we should sort of scale back a bit, or, pare down a bit. So, is it a global issue, would you say?
Yeah, definitely a global issue. I just, I wouldn't have thought of it in terms of like globalization before I read this, and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, so think of like, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, kind of going off that, like all of these other things are, they usually, they have some kind of like diplomatic relationship. There's like, countries like speaking to each other, but with environmental, like, there's no, the U.S. like pollution doesn't stop at the U.S. border, like, and same with any country, like it's something that impacts everybody regardless of like your relation with another country. So that, I thought that was just kind of interesting how that's different from, the economic and the military.
I would even recall, like, I think it was Ford, I don't want to say Goodyear, I think it was Ford. They were doing their tire manufacturing in Brazil in the 70s and 80s. I don't know if it's still there now, but they were polluting the Amazon River with the tire or whatever waste from the plant or whatever. So it is, so there's sort of like a firm that's based in Detroit. I don't know if they're still, I think they're still based in Detroit, is now, polluting in the Amazon. There's even Fordlandia. Has anybody heard of that one in Brazil? Raise your hand if you've heard of Fordlandia. Okay, so tell me about that.
Oh, I've heard of it. I don't know.
Sort of, okay. Yeah, Fordlandia, so they tried to move a lot or outsource a lot of the manufacturing. I don't think it worked though. Again, I'm not an expert on Fordlandia, but I have heard of the topic. So again, here it's interesting to Brazil. And so they made the city sort of like a tax haven, tax-free, very little regulation to none. But nonetheless, for some reason the shipping didn't work or something, I don't know. So, but they were trying to do that in the 80s and 70s, I don't know. But anybody could look that up, I guess. Or you could do Ford and discuss about this and bring this to that's an interesting one. So, although I would say they're still a global firm, although perhaps not considered as global as say like a Toyota or maybe Tesla now. So one of the things that's interesting about American autos is that they're not typically seen as global leaders in any sort of market. Perhaps maybe trucks, even then Toyota seems to be the global leader in trucks. So quite interesting. So what's another one? So that's a good one. Environmental. You know, you have the whole carbon footprint. Think of China now coming online. China's industrialized. You know, it's sort of like the elephant in the room. They're like, oh no, they still got some time to go. No, they're fully industrialized and they're still a global superpower, perhaps the leading superpower in the world. Although we pretend not to acknowledge it, it sort of happens that way. But think of, you know, the amount of cars we have on the road here and in China. If that were to happen with 1 billion people, it's countries over 3 times the size in terms of population. We know a large proportion of Americans drive cars to and from work. Would that work in China? So is the move to electric vehicles something that is important? Whether it be right now we're doing lithium, but the idea is that we eventually move to the, did we mention that last time in class? I think we did, like the fuel cell battery that's based off hydrogen or something. Eventually we get there, you know, maybe 10, 20 years from now, which is like a fully water-based battery, essentially. It's hydrogen-based. So, and they have powered like iPhones with that I've been aware of. So it's quite interesting. It's out there. It's just a matter of perfecting it and making it stable and something feasible. So, and then Tesla's in a good spot. And then you said, what was the other company doing that? Maybe you know a little bit more about that than I do. If you
Lucid Motors.
Lucid?
Yeah, LUCID.
Who runs that?
I think it's out of Germany, but I'm not sure.
Oh, Germany? Okay. Yeah, I haven't heard of that one myself. But the idea was that Ford would eventually get into that. BMW, I think, and Volkswagen were trying to go electric as well. And so you think that the size of their supply chains and their reach might be a little bit better and sort of overpass or overtake Tesla, although they are right now the industry standard for those fully electric vehicles. Although we do remember Toyota had the Prius, right? Were we old enough to remember that one? Where that was like a thing for a while. Like if you had the iPhone 1 and then you had the Prius, you were like cool. You were like high tech back then. So, but wow, how times change. You know, just a matter of years, and that's like, what would happen if you did see someone driving a Prius? You're doing bad or something. I don't know. Does anybody have a Prius? I'm sorry. Farnham the Prius. Okay. How's the reliability on that? Has it been good or? So it works and the fuel economy. I've always wanted one, but I'm even scared of the Tesla one. Like, what do I do if it breaks? Like, who's gonna pay for this? So I've always been like apprehensive about the Prius. So, all right, so which other ones did we not cover? The military. What would that be like? Military globalism.
Like they say in the example, sort of like the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But I feel like the one that I thought was like the U.S. with Japan when like they first introduced themselves to Japan. Like Japan had been secluded, and then the U.S. was like by that time had like a massive navy back in like the 1800s.
All right, so again, perhaps going beyond the scope of this course, it would be more like an IR related topic would be the whole military idea. But I mean, we are talking about like the petrodollar and that sort of regime. So there are some financial elements to it. So it's quite interesting. And then, did we talk about Russia last time we were here? Russia with the Gazprom, which is their major oil, gas producer that, you know, essentially heats most of Northern Europe and Northern and Central Europe. So again, in terms of military, you know, sanctions, relations are going to be involved in how commerce plays out. Again, we hear a lot of tensions between the U.S. and China. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a very smart thing to do for the Americans, considering that they get so much of the products from China? Should America, if we just step back a second and be like, should they be trying to chastise China, or is that a smart move? What do you guys think? What's the opinion there? And again, it's interesting to just hear ideas. So again, this would be sort of like a military dimension to globalization. What's the outcome of that? Probably not good, right? No? Okay, we'll just leave that aside. So, but yeah, but there's a lot of interesting things to think about. So when you do hear a lot of rhetoric on the news, you start to wonder, like, you know, how do I position myself in terms of investments, and, you know, what's the outlook for something like this? Other things I saw interesting in the article that still remain quite relevant is the idea of like thick versus thin globalism. Who could tell me a little bit about that? Like a thin versus thick globalism. And this was something discussed by David Held. No one? Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of what I took away from the article about thin versus thick is that thin globalization tends to impact like a more selective group of people and involves kind of like minimal inputs. The example they gave was the Silk Road, how it kind of really only impacted the wealthy, I believe, and it was like a very non-impactful kind of path through like a very small, well, like a long area, but not a very like wide area, so to speak.
Right.
Versus that of like thick globalization, which they described as like more intensive and more extensive. And the example they gave was the global financial market, where regardless of your kind of financial standing, basically everybody in the world is affected by the global financial market, whether it's like commodity goods or institutional goods.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. So, and then the Silk Road example, this starts back from 140 BC to 1800 AD between trade between China and Europe. So, I mean, the whole idea of globalization is not anything new. And that's one of the things that we'll discuss a bit within the lecture itself once I get into, you know, the thick of things here. But yeah, the thick globalization versus thin, you know, how so David Held is can be considered one of the skeptics when it comes to globalization, and he sees things more as regional in approach. So again, quite interesting in terms of the idea of that. The extreme to that thickness would be the Thomas Friedman, which is mentioned right there, just below that in The World is Flat. Thomas Friedman, a New York Times writer. He's written a couple of books on globalization, very popular books. I mean, I don't agree with some of the things that is said there in terms of the world is flat. It's completely borderless. And again, these books were written in the late 90s and then in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. I think 2006, 2007 was the last time I heard about it. Yeah, did you have something?
Yeah, so did you assign this specific article because you think that deglobalization is a trend that we're seeing, or just because it's an interesting statement?
The second one. You're talking about the second article?
No, the first article. Like, why did we read it? Is it because you thought it was an interesting viewpoint, or because you see the world going towards deglobalization?
Well, this one doesn't talk about deglobalization at all. The Joseph Nye one? Which one? You're talking about the second one. Yeah, we haven't gotten to that one yet. Yeah, I do see, well, they're interesting. So we'll discuss, though. It's quite complex. So the whole idea is a bit mired. And so the idea of the lecture today is to try to get us to a place where we neither see the world as globalizing or deglobalizing. Perhaps the world has just been the way it is for many years. And that's the whole idea. I didn't want to give away too much until we get there. But yeah, the first thing we do is read sort of the cases and we see, again, you can kind of see where I'm headed towards, where I tell you, like, look, you know, there's nothing new here going on. We're looking at Silk Road 1.0. Again, we're on slide 17 or something like that. But for the 140 BC to 1800 AD, we've had trade with China, we've had trade with other countries, and actually there's been periods, I'll just give something, I'll give you a little something, that there's been periods maybe in the 20th century where globalization has been actually, appears quite higher through the data. And so we'll see about that. So, but again, the point of this is that we get a lot of rhetoric and perhaps divergent views. Maybe they're just trying to sell books, but this is like the zeitgeist out there right now. Or for the past 20 years, it's been like, oh, we're on a globalizing trend. What do we do? And so what should we be really doing here? Where should we be looking, and how do we hone in on things with a more clear or judicious mind, so to speak, right? Sort of like, let's cut through the malarkey of it and sort of the hyperbole, which a lot of these articles do. So like, when you're saying that the world is flat, it's truly borderless, well, is it? So some of the things I'm looking at. There's also contagion, right? Somebody mentioned like the environment. Obviously, what's another environmental issue we're dealing with right now? Why do we have our masks on? Right? So we can see just how interconnected we are. I remember being teaching an economics course during while COVID was spreading around China and Wuhan and all that, and we're like, well, you know, is this gonna come to the U.S.? And many people didn't think that way. They was like, oh, this is just an issue that's gonna stay local or regional, and it's not really gonna spread out. But then we saw it come into Italy and then go from there, and sort of. So again, how connected are we? We are certainly interconnected when it comes to travel. We are traveling more now. Immigration is another issue that we'll see that is not as clear cut. So while we might be traveling more for leisure, we'll see that immigration maybe has died down a bit, which is an interesting thing. So in that regards, it's a little tougher to see there. But again, so let me see what else we got here. Just trying to milk this case. Institutional velocity, that's another one that I made note of here. So who could tell me a little bit about institutional velocity as we try to make sense of the idea of globalization? How has it sped up? Again, the idea that, like, even with our relations with China, we're seeing a lot more interconnectivity. Even like through the spread of a virus, we're seeing that, you know, we're very closely connected to even China through trade, travel, diplomacy. So who could tell me a little bit about institutional velocity? No one caught that one? So this would be, again, the idea, it's another way to think about thick versus thin globalism, if you want to see it this way. So one of the things they cite here is, you know, how fast the steamship, once the steamship came out, how fast did that change how we get to and from London to New York? So before it would take maybe 2-3 weeks on a ship. It cut it down to about a week to get from London to New York. And then you have the transatlantic cable that come later on, around the time. And then we see how that sped up communication with you know, code and messaging there. Then the telephone brought it down to minutes. Then we see the internet. It's really opened up in terms of e-commerce, in terms of buying and selling, and the bandwidth is bigger. So while we had the transatlantic cable, there was little, you know, it was a lot smaller in terms of what you could put out there and how you could communicate. So now with the, you know, we're pretty much at a level where we're gonna get I mean, in terms of communicating between Europe and the US, it's probably has never been better with the internet, yes.
Can you kind of explain how institutional velocity might be a function, not so much of message velocity, but more of like the intensity of contact?
Well, absolutely. So through the communication there, you're going to get more contact, obviously. So if I could, spread my ideas, I could do a Zoom meet, I could do YouTube, and connect, music. Think about before. Could we really connect music? How would we connect? How would we share a song or a record or even a motion picture? Let's say in the time of the transatlantic cable. It'd be kind of tough, right? It'd probably be on a big black record or something like that, or a reel, and then send the reel on a ship. So there's a lot of things that have changed in terms of connectivity, especially with regards to culture, exchange of culture. Definitely it's cheaper, faster, there's broader bandwidth to share multimedia and culture, but still, there's still things left out there. So finance-wise, we're not as connected as we used to be financially to the global economy. And again, it's debatable in terms of migration. We've seen migration sort of stagnate, whereas before, think of all the movement that was coming from maybe Europe and from Asia to America. We've seen a lot of that slow down, where it's now just even the Mexican migration is like sort of like an issue now, politically. Oh, how do you, how do you close off the, pretty much just putting a fence around the entire country, in and out. And then outside as well. So Europe's gotten a little tighter, pretty much everywhere. Even going to maybe Asia is just as hard. I've applied for jobs there, and it's difficult to get in and out of different states. You really have to have a good reason nowadays to go somewhere. So in that regards, so you're going to see that the intensity and the channels change over time, and they ebb and flow. So maybe now that's one of the things that's going on, but maybe 5-10 years from now, it'll be a little bit different in terms of what's being shared and what's not. Capital flows is a big one that we see. I see a lot of capital flows coming from Latin America into the US as well. So while we hear a lot of rhetoric, there's also a lot of money coming from Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela into the US. Guess where that would be? Where would be the global hub for money coming from Latin America into the US? It's kind of an obvious one, but what would you guys assume would be the place? Well, Miami. Miami's become the financial hub for global outflows out of Latin America. A lot of the Wall Street banks have headquarters in Miami's or satellite offices, and they're actually trying to move a lot. Now with Bitcoin, they're trying to make Miami like the Bitcoin hub or the Bitcoin epicenter of fintech. I don't know if it's going to work out, but that's been the trend and sort of in the news. Especially since COVID, it's even intensified it more to move to Miami, all the financial technology, so fintech's kind of in Miami and in San Francisco. San Francisco's the other big area for fintech. And I think it's still the leader. I think the Miami thing's a little overblown with the fintech. It's still gonna be Silicon Valley, but nonetheless, I think that's where they're trying to market it in terms of the sales and the sort of the marketing teams are gonna be in Miami. Okay. So what else do we have here? So, okay, so getting back to the idea, who could sum it up for me, the idea of like the complex interdependence, which is more of the thesis of Keohane and Nye here, just to sort of put this article to bed.
One of the things we've been talking about is oil and heating in Europe, especially when the military and politics get involved. So that's an example of a complex interdependent system.
Okay, so the oil, so again, you're talking about sort of like in terms of resources, the geopolitical aspects of it. So again, from what I've gathered, and it's not an issue that I've been watching extensively, but from what I have seen with regards to the tensions between the Ukraine and Russia and the US. And when it comes to Europe, like co-signing, the US is sort of pushing in the region or whatever. They've kind of been like, hey, why don't you relax a little, we want to have cheap gas this winter. Like, why don't you settle down a little? Let us handle this. So Germany and France have sort of taken the lead to say, you guys just need to just relax a little on this one, just ease up. Whereas in the past, they've sort of gone along with a lot of the belligerents. So you're seeing the world change. And with the One Belt, One Road, that one is in week. They're doing a lot of infrastructure, high-speed rail and all that between China and Europe, going in through continental. So that might also be a reason for the world to become a little more global in a sense that it's not just two hegemons fighting each other, whether it's Russia, the US, or the US, China, these sort of hegemonic powers, these huge states fighting with each other. It'll be more like Europe. It'll be more regional in the sense of like you have Europe, Eurasia, Asia, the North America, South America, and everybody's sort of trying to balance themselves out a bit in terms of, everybody has their own interests. And so you're going to have to sort of respect these regional interests as they grow. And also as they grow politically as well. So again, that bleeds into the politics, the political, economic aspects of this. And then, of course, within the defendants, you also have, there's issues of, how the press, music, and film, the interchange of culture, again, is big there with music, film, the press. You also have one that we haven't really talked about much, the non-governmental organizations, right? So you might have women's rights movements or the environment, like the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, and they might be in different areas. So again, there's like lots of transnational women's movements going on in Southern Asia, Southern Asia, and also in the Middle East. So of course, and I had one of my good friends wrote on that while I was doing my PhD. I did mine on Argentina's relations with the International Monetary Fund, which we will cover maybe next week or the week after, the IMF itself. But yeah, so there's a lot of issues in terms of, how we flatten ourselves out or sort of spread our ideas and interact with other states and our values being spread or shared between others as well. What we can learn from other cultures as well, right? So it's sort of like a give and take. It's always like a dialectical. It's a back and forth, and sort of that. So ultimately, they do see Keohane, going back. This is a 20-year-old article. They still see like U.S. power and policy were crucial to the construction of the post-war institutions, which are the Bretton Woods institutions that we'll be discussing. So, but how's that changing now if there's a global reset? Has anybody heard that? Like the idea of a global reset, like have we spun our wheels too far? And is there a need to sort of backtrack, especially when we're talking about inflation? So now we're talking about issues of inflation. So how does this affect the global landscape? And if there's a new Bretton Woods, which is the idea of, anybody could tell me a little bit about Bretton Woods here so far, or have we not gotten there yet? We'll get there. Yeah, did you?
Well, in the reading, it just said that it was like right before the World War II was about to end, and they kind of decided, it was like the major players essentially gathered together to figure out how they could avoid something like the Great Depression and another world war. And so they established the IMF and the World Bank.
Right, and so that was probably like the group of 7 nations. So the nations that took part of that were going to be the U.S., Britain, France, Germany, a couple others, right? But now with the reset, or the idea of a reset, we're going to have to include others. So it'll be the G20. You're going to include Russia, China, and sort of get together in a way where it makes more sense, less toxic, right? So everybody's sort of involved, and we can have some sort of peace around the world. Hopefully, that's the idea of the whole global reset. We sort of quell the idea of inflation, and whatnot. Again, there's interesting things going on, and when we get to the Bretton Woods issues, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that.
Do you think that's gonna happen? Like a meeting with all of them?
Well, I'd be speculating it now. Again, the last time it happened was in 1936, I think, in Bretton Woods, right here in New Hampshire. So just up the 90. Is it 90 that goes up? Which one's the one that goes up from here, from Amherst up to New Hampshire? What's the highway? Does anybody know? Is it 90?
91.
91. So yeah, just straight up 91, maybe another hour or half an hour. You get Bretton Woods, and all like the chief economists met there. Again, quite an interesting thing that happened. So again, from there we have the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements was a little bit before that, but nonetheless, those are all tied into the whole global financial architecture. So how did we rebuild Europe? How did we rebuild Japan after the war? A lot of that came out of the Bretton Woods Accords. And of course, the dollar as a standard was there as well. Even though it was on the gold standard till 71, that's a whole different issue, but we're still pretty much living on the Bretton Woods agreements. So with that, we covered pretty much the article on Keohane and Nye. I think the key takeaway here is that we see that we live in an international world. I think that'll be the key takeaway from the entire class today, is that we don't live in this global world where there's just a free for all. And we'll see how in the lecture now how the nation state is also involved. Any other questions with the Keohane and Nye article? If not, we'll go on to the deglobalization one, and then we'll take a quick break after that. Nothing? All right, so who could tell me a little bit about deglobalization? This one is a really short one, right? So it shouldn't take long to sort of get through the fine points here, and then we'll take a 10-15 minute break and come back and do the lecture slides. Who could tell me something about the idea of define deglobalization? What does that mean? Oh, and again, with the Keohane and Nye, again, these are concepts. So again, he's trying to approximate, or they are trying to approximate to reality. So you can take it with a grain of salt. But again, it's good reading, and you're talking about some of the major players in terms of international relations there. So who could define deglobalization for me?
Basically the idea of becoming more individualistic, nations being less connected, and you'd probably have to localize supply chains, and it would involve a reduction of trade and just probably make things more competitive.
So what?
I'm assuming it would probably make things more competitive because everyone's more individualistic.
Right, everyone's looking out for just their national interest, nationalism, mercantile, a sort of mercantilist trade.
Yeah, in the article that you had us read, there was the take that either it already is or it soon will be more profitable to do things at a local or regional level, where people in those positions can make decisions on hiring and budget versus from a national or international corporation level.
Okay. So we're looking at, do we hire local versus going abroad, outsourcing? Those are the sort of issues. Is it over? Is the whole outsourcing bonanza over? Who agrees or disagrees, or who thinks that's good or prudent?
I invested in a stock because I assumed that would happen because of just climate change and just reinvesting in small emerging markets, but it has not done well. So I honestly don't know what to think.
So wait, so you're invested in, what was that?
It was a mutual fund to sort of support emerging markets, localized companies, but it's not.
An emerging market fund? What was the name of that one?
VMMSX.
Is that the same one from last time?
No.
VMSS? So you're like the financial guru here, like the Warren Buffett. What was the other one you gave me too? You did.
I don't remember.
Oh, you moved on already? It's 2 weeks ago. All right, so that's interesting. Okay, so you're telling me that emerging markets are probably not in terms of in that instrument that it wasn't a,
At least not yet.
yeah. I mean, yeah, so there's, Peter Schiff is one guy that's always in the news. I don't know if you've heard of him. Have you heard of him? He's always on the news and he's saying, get out of, American stocks, at least for the time being, because of the COVID inflation, with the stock prices being so high, up maybe 200% since 2020, or 100%, they're at least double. He's saying, get out and go into emerging markets. That's what he's saying is his place. So you're on like the Peter Schiff bandwagon. He also likes gold, which I agree with gold, although it seems a bit high still too, when you look at the historical trend of where gold is. So in order to hedge against the inflation. But again, that's an interesting viewpoint, because you're telling me, well, are we receding that? But you could take that in different ways, right? So that one is like, are emerging markets, are we deglobalizing then because they're not doing well, or are they globalizing? So I guess, like, which way would you suggest or think from that?
I would say we're probably leaning more towards deglobalization.
Okay, so then you see that as an aspect of deglobalization. Okay, interesting. And then you got skin in the game too, so you put money. All right, so that's a good one. All right, so that's fantastic. All right, who else? Who could continue, who could add on more to deglobalization as a definition, as a term? Although you did well with did anybody, I think you had your hand up, or are you back? Who else had their hand up? Somebody?
I did, but it was more or less just giving a definition.
Okay. All right, and again, so when you see this article, we see that as we enter a new decade characterized by rising economic complexity and geopolitical divisions, U.S.-China tensions. That seems to be like everything in these things. Is U.S.-China tensions, always populism and nationalism in Europe, and also in the U.S. as well. So it's a whole sort of Trumpism. What do you see that as a result of? This whole like angry Europe, this whole angry America, which it sort of has become. Maybe I missed that too thought I had some notes on that too. Where do you see that coming from when it comes to business or whatnot? Do you think business has a role in the sort of angry America? We were also talking about how, globalization as it relates to government as well, and business. So how do we sort of navigate those two components?
Well, like, I know that at least before the pandemic and stuff, there were attempts to sort of like repatriate companies. You know how like there were Chinese companies that were opening factories in the U.S. and stuff. So I don't know. It's just sort of, I think that the deglobalization thing is almost just being like hyped up more than it's real.
Okay.
Well, now with COVID, it's kind of high because like with like supply chains issues and stuff, it might just be more feasible to deal locally than having to like go through all these restrictions with international trade. But yeah, I think like a lot of like most people by and large still respect like globalists or like a globalism. Like,
all right, so but who should we be mad at? Should we be mad at a different state, or should we be mad at where should we put our attention on? It seems sometimes we put our attention in areas where it doesn't really matter, or it's not going to really be productive. So who should we be mad at in terms of maybe no jobs here for people, the domestic workers, lower working class people, or middle class, lower class people, maybe they don't have past a bachelor's degree, but are capable to work.
Well, for that specific example, I think that would probably largely be a product of like these massive corporations chasing increased profit margins, right?
Yeah, okay, so you hit it on the head. Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, just like outsourcing labor and exploiting other countries.
Right, because, yeah.
Allowing the big businesses that he was talking about pay for legislation to work in their favor, and then that kind of just snowballs.
Right, and then so who should we be mad at in that regard? besides the company, obviously okay, so we got company is Exhibit A, and who else?
Ourselves.
Pretty much, right? Well, through the government, the legislature, the government, you should be mad at the government, which is basically yourself, right? So it's ourselves, so we're just sitting by, with our mouths open perhaps, and not really doing much, just breathing out our mouths or something. So, I mean, yeah, instead of like we projected on the naughty Russians or, China, no, you just permitted all this. So it's like, and then so a lot of the firms were actually exploiting Chinese labor for many years and so on, paying a pittance of wages and all this, which they couldn't get away with here. So then what do you do to change that? And then how do we get to a place where we could have global trade that works? I mean, so any ideas of what we can do?
I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of reassessment since the pandemic broke out, like here in the States at least. I feel like there's been a big reassessment as to like paying people more, like higher wages and the great, like, I forget what they call it, but like the great reset on like, they're like, and people are finding jobs that are paying more and stuff like that.
Okay. That's a good one. Let's see what else. So what they also talk about the splinter net. Who could explain that a bit in this article? Like the world is deglobalizing. There's different internets with an S, which was a funny one because I remember you guys are probably still young, but like I think it was George Bush Jr. in the mid-2000s, he was like, the internets, I heard rumors on the internets, and everybody was like laughing at it. There's only one internet, dude, what are you talking about? But they're saying that there are internets in the sense that different states are gonna control the narrative of what's able to be said in country A versus country B. Would you say that our internet's completely free at this point, or no? Or is there some censorship on the internet here as well? What are they censoring?
Like, theoretically, it's free, but also at the same time, like every platform's a private company, so it's not like you have to listen to their rules and not like the government's. So if they say like, you can't talk about X, Y, or Z.
Right, you'll get deplatformed now. So, and it's typically now been for the right wing has been getting the most deplatformed and all that. But then eventually it'll be the left as well. It's typically the way it happens. It's not going to be just one side gets deplatformed. It's everybody gets deplatformed. But that's been the interesting thing with the internet is that it went from something where you start your own web page, where you are kind of organically doing this on your own. You can even get your own server and you run the web page from your home, with a server or whatever, to now you're on like a Google, or you're on this, or you're on that, right? You're on Spotify, or whatever it is. The last hubbub was the one on Spotify now, right? But that one was obviously some issues there, but at the same time, it's like, where do you draw the line in censorship? But again, you make a great point, because does a company want to be associated with a certain, rhetoric like that or whatever? And of course, they're going to be like, get rid of this or whatever. Because it's not theirs. So again, it's not your private property at that point. It's, you're working for someone else's platform. Anybody have any agree, disagree on what the internet should be? And the reason I bring this up is because they try to say here like that the internet is like more freer here versus like, let's say in Europe or China or whatever. Again, it's like always the back and forth. It's like, oh, in Russia you can't say anything. Well, here there's limits too everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, there was like the big thing back in 2019 about net neutrality as well. So not only do private companies control what people can put on social media, but also private companies control what like websites and information can get through to your phone or computer. So I think maybe a big difference between here and China or Russia is private companies control basically what you can and can't see versus the government controlling that in other parts of the world.
Right, so it's the same, it's just a different boss. He's the old boss, meet the new boss type of thing. One of the things I find is that with the whole iPhone scenario. This is an issue that there's cases, Harvard cases on the iPhone issue. Anybody know or had anything in terms of an IT class where you discussed iPhone security issues or anything like that?
Well, wasn't that the case with like the San Bernardino shooting, and like the couple had files on their phone?
Yes,
So it was,
yeah.
like,
Which class did you take that with? Or you just, okay. So in BU, that's a big one, and I think it's in an ethics course. That's a big case that they look at in terms of internet privacy. So the San Bernardino was like an ex-police or somebody that worked at a police station, but he happened to be also like Muslim or something like that, and he ended up shooting, I believe. I think that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Or that's what they said. That's the narrative. The narrative was something like that he ended up shooting, how many, like at a police station or something. He opened fire. And then they were able to arrest them, but then they wanted to like access their phone in order to find if they were at like a terrorist cell or whatever. And Apple, this was in 2016, and Apple said, no, we're not allowing, they wanted a back door into the phone. They said, we want a back door into the phone, but not only his phone or her phone, or I think it was a couple, right? Was it like a couple?
Yeah, it was a husband and wife, but the whole thing was like, I think they had purchased guns illegally, so they needed like to see the messages to see who they like purchased the weapons.
Right, to see who, to just get everybody they could out of, incriminate whoever else.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't happen again. And again, the cause was noble. Yeah, we don't want terrorism and we don't want this, but then the idea was you give us this back door and then we have access to every American's phone. Every Apple phone in America. So that was the whole idea. They said no. But then now later on, I think it was more recently, due to like pedophilia issues. Now it's always like these crazy issues. They're opening up. They actually have like an office where people are like looking through phones. Did anybody hear that one or no? So they like look through your phone. Like if you have an image that could be potentially like child porn or something, there's like a person that's in an office and they're like looking at there's like a like some sort of like department that looks at your iPhone pictures and like figures this out, and then like I'll notify the authorities locally. So again, we're back to square one. We're like, yeah, you didn't get the back door, but still now you're looking at all the like your whole camera roll. Like you have access to the entire camera roll of every phone. So again, it's like one of those things where, how private or how protected are we, and where do you draw the line? Again, do I agree or disagree? I obviously don't agree that they should be. How do you protect children? I have 3 children myself. I always want to protect them, but at the same time, where do you draw the line in terms of privacy? And then who's being hired to look at these pictures? Are they themselves weirdos, or what's their intention? Because I wouldn't want to work that type of job either. I don't know. It'd be like a strange. There's some people that might be good intentioned, but then again, so it's like a whole can of worms. Why not just have the privacy and nobody look at no one's photos and then try to catch the people? I don't know. So it's one of those things where. But the reason I brought that up is just so you see, like America's privacy laws aren't very upheld either. So in the case, they sort of make it an issue where it's like, Europe and the West have the moral high ground. Russia and China are always the naughty guys or whatever. So again, I don't believe in those sort of dualities, and I think that's counter. It's counterintuitive. It's like unconstructive sort of rhetoric.
Counterproductive?
Huh?
Counterproductive?
Yeah, counterproductive. That's the word I'm looking for. It's sort of just like not taking us anywhere to just keep on doing that. But again, I think one of the interesting things and that the case missed out was what we mentioned is that, where should we be looking at in terms of anger? It should be at the firm level, maybe at the state, at our own, at our own sort of laziness when it comes to, enforcing regulation and laws on labor practices here in the US, where you have Amazon workers up to recently. They're trying to change Amazon now. It seems like they're trying to get with the program, but we see that there was a lot of issues where like people would have to like urinate themselves. Did anybody hear that on the assembly line and all that while they're working? They couldn't take bathroom breaks, and it was just a very toxic sort of like Yeah, so like the labor conditions were awful. It's horrendous labor conditions, and to make what? I think they had people living in RVs outside of the factories or warehouses or whatever. So again, just who do we look at? Do we look at, what do we want to blame somebody, 2,000-3,000 miles away, or what do we look at here? How do we fix things here? Again, they also talk about the issue of corporate finance, whether it could be deglobalized or is it globalized. Again, any questions with this? Or any comments with regards to globalizing finance versus deglobalized finance? And I think here, the data seems kind of antithetical to the empirics, the rhetoric here that they're using in the case. And again, this is Harvard Business School, so I'm critical of them when they write silly things. But we'll see in the lecture that the data shows that finance was a little bit more global or globalized maybe in the 1920s, in the pre-war era, than now. So we saw a lot more exchanges and different things going on in different places where we could invest pre-World War I, essentially. So quite interesting to see that. Let's see. Again, but we seem to be like right back where we were in the pre-World War I level era, where we're like, America's angry, you have Europe being angry, and then they're not really looking at the right. And it's like, are we going to do this again? Hopefully not. Like some sort of thing. So again, where are we redirect? Can we redirect the anger towards the, addressing our corporations here and the way they treat us who work for them? And you all that'll be in positions to be good leaders, will you be good stewards, and how you would take it out there once you're in the workforce? So that'll be your job, not mine. I'm just here to talk about it. I'm hiding. I'll just hide. Again. So again, we'll see with that. So what can we do to sort of get things to progress? What do you guys think as your opinion here in the idea? Should we be deglobalizing? Should we be globalizing? Is there some sort of balance in between the two that we could do with states?
I think with the flow of information and the speed of travel the way it is today, like it doesn't make any sense to go towards deglobalization, because then you're just limiting yourself and your company from other opportunities or resources that aren't in your country.
Right. Okay. So we should still embrace the sort of the global idea of trade, global trade, perhaps, or maybe not trade, maybe global production. Do we have to import stuff from China? Why can't we, let's say Nike, build the shoes that are going to be made regionally and distribute them within, the Asia region, out of China, and then perhaps have a plant distribute shoes regionally in North America here? That would make more sense. Would that?
Yeah.
Something like that, maybe, and then you have a sort of a balance in between.
Well, they actually mentioned that in one of the articles that you had us do. It was like the one for the second week.
Okay.
But they mentioned that how like Nike's got like a very broad supply chain across like 40 different countries. So even though they do have a presence in China, they're not completely reliant on it.
Right. So I guess so. I'm skipping ahead. Yeah. So I'm skipping ahead there. Is that like a frat house back there?
Yeah.
They're like having a good old time. I'm here lecturing. It's distracting of it. They're like about to barbecue or something. I'm like, all right, my goodness, I have to close the blind. I don't want. I'm getting jealous. All right. For me, it's like joint ventures. How do you? And that's the one thing that China did well in that I'd like to see in Latin America, because Latin America has sort of taken a beating with the very free market approach that they've taken. And so I'd like to see the more joint venture where, like in China, what they saw is even since the early outsourcing that took place there, whether it be Nike or any of the electronic firms like iPhone or whatever, China has always had a thing where like, oh no, we want to be 51% owners in the business. So yeah, they might not own Apple, but they own like the Foxconn. Anybody's heard of that? Like they own the factory that produces at least 51%. So that was a brilliant maneuver in terms of at least, you know, controlling the production. Say, okay, well, you guys control, essentially what they did is they said, you guys control the marketing from California or whatever with the iPhone or whatnot, but we'll do the production side. And, you know, send us the plans or whatever. So if different states could do that, they'd probably be better off because the balance would be a little fairer. Because again, think of the record number of profits iPhones made, and other phones like Nike being a powerhouse, a behemoth, global behemoth when it comes to apparel, shoes, and marketing. So if you take a marketing class, Nike should be like the company of choice in order to emulate in terms of what, the brand loyalty and all that. So again, any other last comments? I really like to hear your opinion and push back. And if you think anything I said was silly, just tell me, hey, you know, that's not right or whatever. So, or this is what I think. The whole idea is to have a conversation with you all and really to get you all thinking critically about these issues. You know, where do we look at? Yeah, no? All right, so no questions or comments? All right, so we'll take a 10 to 15-minute break and we'll come back. I think we ran for a while for there, so. And we'll come back and do the slides. So let's do 10 minutes. So we'll get back here at 1:45.
I'm surprised there's not more PDF versions in tonight.
So it wasn't that crazy.
I'm Will.
Will, what's your name? Very nice to meet you guys.
Nice to meet you too. Need to sit here and do finance. Know that? It's just Excel. It's pretty light. It's especially because my teacher is nice.
Do you have just like graphic calculator?
Everything in one spot, and then I can just take numbers from an old formula and I don't actually do it again.
That's true.
His class last semester that he said we're not even doing this. Who did you have for finance?
Dude, Spirowski.
How were tests?
They're not bad. Also, it's all online, so.
Yeah.
And she doesn't.
I feel like I've read your syllabus. The 2 quizzes are so if you do might just be able to, especially because the extra credit's so great, class we're talking about. Get a notice on
So did anyone buy the text, this textbook? No? Yeah, you probably won't need it. I take a little bit out of the textbook and then combine it with my own stuff. So like this one that was interesting was, again, Beijing being Starbucks is #1 growth market. Quite an interesting one as well to see. Again, the spread of Starbucks. I think I mentioned Starbucks too, within Italy and in Miami. So again, it's still spreading globally. A couple more minutes. Class ends at 2:15, so man, we've talked for a while already. Time flies when you're having fun, right? Or does it feel like an eternity, right? Because it's relative. All right, so we're all here. So I guess I'll just jump in. We'll go along. People will trickle back in. Just to cover some time. So we'll be starting now. Okay. You guys all set? Yeah. All right. Apologies for starting 2 minutes early, but yeah, I just figured we don't got much time, so we'll just go. Never got to the meat and potatoes here. All right, so what is international business and why is it important? All right, it's defined as business carried out across national borders. There's a foreign business, essentially, what we're talking. Denotes operations of a company outside of its home market. And then you also have the definition of an international company, which is a company with operations in multiple nations. All right, the term international carries implications for domestic job seekers, investors, entrepreneurs, and even students as yourselves. Again, this is why it's important to understand the domestic market, the international market, as it relates to even the domestic market. So there's implications for everyone here. All right, so the influence of external and internal environmental forces. Again, external forces consist of the following: competitive, distributive, economic, physical, and so on and so forth. Internal environmental forces, however, when it comes to the firm, you have to think more on a microeconomic level. So think about the forces and the levers that you might be able to pull from within your organization. Again, a lot of times what it boils down to when you're in the organizational level is the culture of the organization itself. So that'll be a huge dependent on the ability that you'd be able to maneuver within an organization will be dependent on the culture as well. External changes, again, we touched on this a bit, and hopefully we can leave this aside for next class. But again, the whole Brexit thing going on, the Trumpism in the U.S., and so how do we know there's issues in the U.S., but are they being redirected politically for political reasons and the sort of anger, hostility? And again, in Brexit too, I was in England around this time. I was teaching there, so I'm familiar with the whole Brexit movement as well. And it's sort of the same thing. It's a disenfranchised population. Inflation keeps on going up. And so the working poor, working class are angry, and with reason. But now what isn't reasonable is then the hate and vitriol. Whereas I think we were able to locate, at least to this far, that we should be looking nationally, right? Like, what do we do with our corporations, and how do we manage our firms in order so they spread the wealth? Because they are, like, if we look at the S&P right now, even though they lost about 8%, they've gone back up, they're still making record profits, right? We know that, right? So firms could never be better, at least till this point, supposedly. So then why is it that there's so much anger and resentment throughout our society? And a lot of it will boil down to economic reasons. People aren't getting jobs,
When you say firm, does that mean company?
Yeah, so like the company, a firm, corporation. Again, so what drives the internationalization of business? There's essentially 5 key drivers, all based on change and are leading international firms to internationalize their operations. These be political, technological drivers, market drivers, cost drivers, competition, whether it be like Nike versus Adidas, or Nike versus, Reebok or whatever. And you have China come in, Li Ning. So we see all this global competition. Again, somebody else mentioned cost over here, right? Earlier, like a lot of the firms outsource because they want just higher margins, right? So that was the initial reason to outsource, but that's not the only reason. They also want to compete in those markets that they might produce in at some point. And then there's also technology, whatever. So there's lots of different reasons. Those are the key there. Drivers of internationalization of business. There's also political drivers as well. So there's drivers of globalization. These tend to be the unification and socialization of the global economy. Again, the idea that there's a liberalizing barriers to trade, to capital. These would be political as well. These could be, so these could be sort of maneuvered politically. So you could sort of tighten trade, or essentially ease the gap on trade, or ease the spigot on trade, or close it politically. There's privatization in terms of the different industries. If you're looking at, let's say the Ukraine, which used to be a former communist nation, how they liberalized their economy, and so on and so forth. So is there more opportunity to then interact, both for the firms and also for states as well, as they open up their markets? In the UK, one of the things they privatize, doesn't have to be a communist country or socialist country, but in the UK, anybody know what they recently sold off or in the recent past? No? They sold off like their subway systems, their train systems. And they essentially privatized their train system. But the irony in that one, I guess, well, nobody knew that, right? The irony in that one is that who do you think bought it? This is the funny thing.
The government?
Which one? It was the French or German government ended up buying it. So they were like talking all this stuff about liberalizing and, you know, free market, and just the German government went, or it was the French government went and nationalized it. So now like, are they better off? I don't know. All right, so what is driving the internationalization of business? Again, more. These would be technological drivers, advances in computers. Again, this would be sort of the Thomas Friedman approach, where he says the world is flat, and he also used an analogy like, you know, instead of they knocked down the Berlin Wall, and what we had instead were windows. What are the windows? What's the analogy saying? You guys get that one, right? Like the PC, right? So the connectivity of Windows PC or whatever. So they saw like the end of the Cold War as providing also opportunities due to the rise of the internet and this whole higher bandwidth era of communication, high bandwidth era of communication between the different continents. So not just between the, you know, whatever. So technology is certainly a driver. Again, we've touched here and there on cost drivers that could, and again, these are all fair questions for like the midterm, these little tidbits here. So what are the different drivers? So what are the cost drivers of globalization or the internationalization? If you want to be more specific, it would be development costs, production costs, inventory costs, and so on and so forth. Let's see here. So some more cost drivers would be here. So some governments offer investment incentives to foreign businesses. So again, you might think of like the example I gave you with Brazil, as bringing the Fordlandia, so you'd have laxer environmental regulation, laxer labor regulation, tougher on people that want a higher wage. And again, from the side of the room that mentioned better margins. Did somebody have their hand up?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're gonna throw slides up on Blackboard.
Yeah, actually, I'll put them on the Google Drive right after I'm done here. So we'll do that. However, there are costs to both at the state level, at the macro and micro level. So again, a lot of the internationalization of trade, finance, it may lead to things like inflation, unemployment, due to the closing of factories. At the micro level, you could have supply chain losses, like we've seen issues with the supply chain. You might have international intellectual property concerns, whether they're stealing your technology or whatever. But those are the costs of international business, right? Of going abroad to do this is a private company, so you'd have to, these are decisions you'd make at the private level, the micro level, and if you have the wherewithal, you should have the wherewithal. If they're stealing your technology or something, it's your fault. So the onus should be on the firm, not on them on appealing to the state. Well, why'd they steal my, my blueprints or whatever? All right. So but at this micro level, the firm could end up losing their comparative advantage over the long run due to this. you know, you lost your intellectual property advantage, or, you know, did other firms, you know, capitalize on that? And you're not also as vertically integrated, you're outsource essentially your production. So competitive or strategic drivers. Again, I mentioned these before, but just to drill down on them a little bit more. So other reasons that businesses might go international or outside of their nation borders, it's to defend home markets by distracting competitors. They might want to guarantee a supply of some certain raw material, whether it be oil, lithium. Where do they get the lithium for the batteries? Anybody know?
The Congo, like Africa?
Maybe there. Where else?
Not Russia, I don't know.
No, not Russia. I don't think. Well, maybe. Who knows? There might be lithium. Russia's so big, they might have lithium.
I was gonna say India, but they don't.
India?
I can't remember, but I know there's a South American country that a lot of their exports.
I believe it's Bolivia. So yeah, Bolivia is the one I was thinking of. So again, you're going to have a lot of issues in terms of trying to get these, extract these raw materials, and then how do you run into, if you run into resistance, that might be political, whatever. And then there's just market drivers. As firms internationalize, they also become global customers. Firms go abroad to prevent foreign suppliers from gaining access to their customers. Mature home country markets may encourage companies to consider nations with rising GDP per capita, population growth, and higher rates of GDP growth. Again, so think of companies that might be stagnating here and whether emerging markets would look good for their products, right? So where might there be more disposable income now? Whereas maybe here you've reached some sort of peak here, but you might say, oh, I'll tap in. Think of it if you were running a firm. So where would you want to tap in if you were running a certain product, or what your favorite products are, and what markets you think might be conducive to gaining a market share there? Any ideas? What products do you think would translate well globally that haven't? Is there any ones that haven't at this point that you all are aware of?
Like a bus, like a automatic bus. I saw
A bus?
Yeah.
Like a school bus?
Like a self-driving bus.
Okay.
Like,
where do they have that?
It was like some company that like tried to do it, but they went bankrupt.
They probably first have to get good at it here, right? All right, that's a good one though. I like that. Any other ones? A self-driving bus. Okay.
Similar to that, but Uber.
Uber? Yeah. So has Uber gone global or no?
Yeah, they're in England.
In England? In England, yeah. I don't remember using Uber in England, but I'm sure it's there now. Anybody else? That's a good one as well. Uber. Again, a lot of those tech companies are going to be easily translatable over to a different country. All you got to do is change the language, and you're there. And just put up a new app, just whatever. So maybe we'll do this video. Do we have time? We have 15 minutes. Maybe I'll skip on the video. Just watch them on your own. It's a critical discussion. Maybe we'll watch the videos and discuss this, and then we'll pick up later, because a lot of this bleeds into the second discussion anyway for next week. So I'll just hold back a little bit since we're almost out of time. So where were we here?
And welcome back to Ohio Means Business. The current state of the economy has renewed concerns about outsourcing and offshoring and their effects on the U.S. workforce. President Obama addressed the topics during a recent trade visit to India, and those words became lightning rods leading up to the midterm elections. Well, joining us now with the bottom line and a business perspective on outsourcing and offshoring, John Gray, Assistant Professor of Operations at Ohio State's Fisher College of Business. John, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. I think it's good to start off with defining the terms. First of all, offshoring, what exactly is it?
Offshoring is taking an activity and moving it to an offshore location, such as India or China. And that activity could be managed by the your own companies do it, so it could be wholly owned by you, whereas outsourcing is taking an activity and having it managed by another company. But that other company could be right here in Ohio. So the terms are actually often misused during the election.
They're often interchanged and misused.
Yeah, they'll say we just stop outsourcing. Really, they mean need to stop offshoring when they're talking about job losses.
But you can have a situation where there's offshore outsourcing, the two can combine. Explain that.
Oh, it's quite common. If you were to have your product produced by a contract manufacturer in China, or take your IT operation and have a company in India do the entire IT operation for them, that would both be offshore and outsourced. So that would be called offshore outsourcing.
Despite what we've heard about, these things carry a negative connotation because we think that jobs are, in many cases, some jobs are going overseas, but other countries do the same thing. Right down the road in Marysville, we have Honda. They offshore, is that correct to say?
That's correct, yeah. Honda has set up a huge operation in Marysville, Ohio, and that's spawned all sorts of suppliers around there, and certainly Ohio has benefited from Honda and other companies offshoring here to Ohio.
Specifically the advantages of offshoring for a company to do this. Why do they do it? What's the advantage?
Well, from a company perspective, usually the advantage is cost. If you have a high labor operation, even with China's increased emerging economy, the costs are still very low there. It's $1 an hour still in most areas for an employee, for manual labor. So high labor, you get some cost benefits. And also, you may want to enter one of those markets. Those economies are growing and the consumers are starting to purchase more and more. That may be a way to get access to a market, is to offshore to India or China, for example.
And outsourcing, advantages of outsourcing.
So again, outsourcing may not be to another country, it could be just to another company. And often you have companies that take a tire manufacturer in the auto industry. It used to be that back in the 1920s and 30s, the auto companies would make their own tires. Makes more sense to have a company that specializes in tire manufacturing and have.
I get the difference there between outsourcing, offshoring. And we see that, again, it goes back to the Keohane and Nye, how he's talking about interdependence and the sort of the mutual benefits that may be there or may not be there. So again, it's, I don't want to sound like a cheerleader for outsourcing or globalization, because there is their pros and cons. And I think that's the approach that we should take, is have an even keel approach and sort of know that there could be some issues.
Minute MBA. Why outsourcing is bad for business. More companies are hanging this bright yellow tag on outsourcing and offshoring. They seemed like good ideas at the time. According to The Economist, this trend, which began in the 1980s, may finally be winding down. The main reason is that the savings once realized by outsourcing, hiring domestic or foreign contractors, and offshoring, moving work overseas, aren't what they used to be. China and India were once prime targets for US, European, and multinational corporations looking to save a buck. Both were valued for their low-cost pools of highly skilled workers. The skilled workers are still there, but so is intense competition for their services. And as these workers begin to realize their value, they've also become more demanding. The Economist noted, wages in India and China have been going up by 10 to 20% a year for the past decade, and compensation for senior Chinese managers now either matches or exceeds pay in America and Europe. Rising salaries plus the cost of transporting goods to the US market have pushed some companies to reshore some of their production in America. That includes GE, which last year moved production of washing machines and other appliances from China to a plant in Kentucky. Besides higher overseas costs, other factors bolster the argument that the grass isn't always greener in India, China, or Malaysia. A case in point is Apple's relationship with China-based Foxconn. Foxconn's enormous capacity to mass-produce the iPhone and other Apple products was an advantage. But a series of widely publicized reports, most of which focus on Foxconn's abysmal treatment of its workers, outraged many Americans, embarrassed Apple officials, and damaged the company's brand. Chief Executive Tim Cook ordered an investigation. In December, Cook announced that Apple would move production of some Mac computers from China to America. Although Cook declared that the main goal was to create American jobs, it can also be seen as a gesture to placate critics of the Apple-Foxconn relationship. Then there's Boeing, the poster company for outsourcing gone bad. The aerospace giant's saga of flawed batteries has grounded its 787 Dreamliner fleet until a fix can be found. According to the Seattle Times, the likely culprit is the hands-off structure of this round of outsourcing, where the company contracted with about 50 top-tier suppliers and essentially outsourced responsibility. Boeing is no stranger to outsourcing. On earlier jets, the company outsourced work on landing gear, batteries, and engines for the 777 and 737. Both planes are renowned for the reliability. But according to the Times, the company gave too much autonomy to their major suppliers and surrendered oversight of subcontractors to the contractors themselves. The result is that there were too many players working on too many pieces with no centralized system of quality control. Quality, in Boeing's reputation, inevitably suffered. Finally, there's the story of Samsung. For US companies, the rise of the South Korean electronics giant should be a cautionary tale. According to The Economist, South Korean business leaders rarely outsource production and believe that American and European companies are making a mistake in outsourcing as much manufacturing as they do, because this allows other firms a great deal of insight into their processes. They should know it's the blueprint Samsung followed when it was an outsourcing partner for Japanese firms. The loss of intellectual property that ends up strengthening competition. It's an irony, and one more factor for American corporations to consider when deciding whether it's time to bring foreign production home. For more videos from an MBA, check out
So I guess we'll use the last bit of class here that we have, last 10 minutes, to discuss critically. So what do you guys think are the global, the pros and cons of global trade, the potential risks, whether it's good or it's bad? Any thoughts up to this point? 2 hours, so it's tough, right? Worked up, yeah.
I'd say a pro is cost. But
Potentially, right? Or at least up to this point, where now we're seeing costs rise in places that we may have taken advantage of over time, right? Over the last 20 years or so. And we're seeing their standard of livings increase. So, but now, hey, but what gives? That's the free market, that's competition. Yeah.
The con is poor labor conditions.
What's that?
Poor labor conditions is a con.
As a con, yeah, well, yeah, should we be as firms, as managers, should we be taking advantage of, people or desperate people or something, or like in like rural areas of of another country or something, and setting up a plant there to sort of take advantage of people? Should we be doing that? Is one of the ethical dilemmas that we have. And then the irony is, like in the videos noted, is that we're seeing a lot of these developing countries reach the level in terms of compensation close to the American standard or Western world standards, and now we have a problem with them. So it's like now all of a sudden it's an issue. So how do you navigate that, and how do you sort of balance that out is the question. So what? Yeah.
I was going to say another con would be like supply chain control and lack of flexibility if something goes wrong or you order.
Right. So supply chain issues would be a big one. So now I teach some courses on Six Sigma and total quality management. So that's what they're talking about with Samsung not wanting to outsource, whether it's within like South Korea or anywhere. They're not going to want to outsource because they want strict control of their supply chain, of the technology that goes into producing the different parts. They don't want anybody to know, and they also want to rule over it. So like it's very meticulous. So Toyota is one example of this total quality management control, in that, think about Toyota in terms of the reliability of Toyota. They're renowned for their reliability, and it's because they control all their parts and all that.
Well, even outside of quality though, like timing, for example, the Ever Given getting stuck in the
Suez,
and also like all the boats right now that are stuck off U.S. ports, like when.
Right. So I mean, but the whole issue with the boats coming in, that we just don't have the infrastructure domestically to deal with the stuff coming in. It's there. They sent it on time. So like whatever factory, they got it out. It's just stuck there because we don't seem to have the infrastructure for whatever reason. Now, I don't know how it all just came to head so soon, or is it because of COVID? I'm guessing it has a lot to do with COVID, and maybe, I don't know. So
I know another contributing factor to that is the Jones Act. which any trade by sea between two US points has to be done by a ship that was made in the US, flagged in the US, and crewed 100% by US citizens. So yes, I think the infrastructure to like offload that volume of stuff, like we probably don't have, but it probably wasn't that big of a problem until but now with the Jones Act really taking headway over the past, I think it was like 10 years or so.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that one.
You don't have like aside from infrastructure to like manage major shipping ports, the US doesn't really build a lot of ships. And so the ships that they do have are really old. And also like the merchant marine isn't at its highest like staffing levels in history. So everything that basically, like the most of the volume that gets shipped between 2 points in the US has to be by road, when it might be more efficient to do it by sea, but we don't have the capacity to do that.
Right, so infrastructure spending might be a way to resolve some of the issues, because the ships are out there. They're out in the Pacific waiting to come in. The ports they're not unloading fast enough or getting so there's issues in terms of, so would it make sense to either outsource less, maybe bring some production home where you could have more regional production of goods and services while still having your, because you're still, like let's say China again, which is again the poster child for this. You still have China as a market itself, so you don't have to bring the stuff over here. Like another thing they do is they send pears that are harvested in peaches and pears that are harvested in Argentina. They send them raw and they send them over to like Southern Asia, Thailand to package them there, and then they send them back to the US. Does that make any sense? No. So I mean, instead think of trying to make smaller factories that service the region. And again, you're talking about $1 billion market anyway, so China's gonna have a huge market, and you're not only talking China, you're talking Asia, Japan. So regionally, Nike, let's say if we're talking about Nike or some sort of apparel brand, they're still going to have the market accessible there. And then, you don't have to bring everything overseas. So again, it's just, this is the thing that a lot of the C-level, the CEOs and our executives are going to have to deal with in terms of what they're, the nonsensical sort of things that they're sort of doing in terms of their own production at the micro level, again, at the firm level. Any other risks or problems that you see?
I'd say another risk is the potential environmental effects, including like the carbon footprint when all the trucks and the boats and the planes that are flying not only internationally but nationally.
Right, that doesn't make sense either, right? To just be shipping things around like that, it's just kind of like goofy, right? It's like, it's silly. So yeah, and you want to add on, or was that basically? Yeah, so that's a big one too in terms of environmental costs of flying around foods, and this doesn't make any sense. All right, so any other last minute thoughts? All right, so I guess we're free to go. I enjoyed this conversation with you. We'll pick up on it in terms of what is deglobalization, what's the reality of it next week. And then we'll go from there. What's really going on? That'll be the discussion next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. I'll do a review like for yeah, multiple choice, true and false. Another interesting one. Is that a cake? Oh yeah. Yeah, like 9 a.m. So you have till you have it, you should be able to post it if you have it already. You've gotten to it yet or not? I was just looking. Okay. Yeah, just take your time, enjoy. Power awards, yeah, just like a page or two. That's it. Thank you. Last one too. All right.
No, I just looked at it and I was like, that's different.